Say so right now, until the truth comes out. I gave you everything, and I gave you everything. Say so right now, left alone, cried out. I gave you everything, and I gave you everything.
Hello, welcome to PMAR's channel. I'm your host, Patrick Marsden. Hold on here a second. Bam. Alright, so I've always personally felt that IQ tests were bullshit. I think intelligence is a very hard thing to measure with a test in the first place, but I feel like rich people invented these IQ tests as a way to rationalize or justify their oppression of the poor. You know, well, I have all this wealth and success because I have a high IQ, and those people deserve to live in the gutter because they have a low IQ and they're stupid. And I hear people on YouTube all the time, these debates, or just anywhere on YouTube, or even when the communists were trying to take away our gun rights and they staged a march in my city, and I flipped them all both middle fingers as I walked by them. I heard two different people go, "Oh, what is that, your IQ?" And anyways, I just think it's silly to insult people's IQ when this whole IQ test is bullshit. And my friend who I used to do podcasts with like over or maybe about a decade ago now, he sent me this article. This was written by a professor. I think this is from like 2005. And he says that the IQ test is racist. And I haven't read this yet, and I suck at reading, so I don't know. If you don't want to hear me talk about it, I put a link to this article in the description. You can read it yourself. But I thought, you know, if I'm going to read it, I might as well read it on YouTube. And this is pretty lengthy, so I don't know. I guess I'll just dive right into it. Here we go. So we got, there's some more articles. This is chapter 6. I think it's the Resurrecting Race. Is this from his book? This might be actually part of his book. His book is Resurrecting Racism, the Modern Attack on Black People Using Phony Science. Chapter 6. What are IQ tests really about? not intelligence as the IQ testers define this word. I noted in my introduction that John Entine devotes almost 10% of Taboo, I guess a book this guy wrote, to defending IQ testing and praising psychology professor Arthur Jensen and other such IQ researchers. It is certainly odd that Entine should talk so much about IQ in my book that is supposed to be about sports ability. Oh, and that in a book that is supposed to be about sports ability. And that he should go so very out of his way to defend IQ research as he does. So this guy, John Entine, wrote a book basically saying that black people are better at sports and white people are more intelligent. Which, in my opinion, is totally bullshit. I don't think skin color determines how good you are at sports or how intelligent you are or how big your PP is. I don't believe in human races. I believe there is one human race, and all this racism stuff is just hilarious to me because we're run by eugenics freaks. The eugenics people that were behind Nazi Germany are in power in America today, and they're in power all over the world. So to continue reading, but is that racist? You may feel inclined to object that IQ tests are mainstream, that everybody gets tested, that these are objective measures for determining a person's intelligence, etc. What's racist about that? The answer is all of it. Why? Because the approach used in IQ tests, which are widespread in modern American society, has been advanced through a series of pseudo-scientific hoaxes by psychologists who were and are public racists and frauds, and whose objective was to make it seem as if certain categories of people were intellectually inferior, the better to oppress them. They have used fake data, phony statistics, and non-existent researchers conjured out of thin air. I must point out that the two French researchers who invented the measures that become all the basis of IQ testing, Alfred Binet and Théophile Simon, were not racists. Neither were they frauds. But psychologists, who indeed were racist, used rather dramatic lies to turn the Binet-Simon enterprise upside down. In this chapter, we shall begin taking a look at how that happened. Then we shall come back to John Entine and re-examine what he is defending and why. The meaning of intelligence. Intelligence is a word, which is to say a string of letters, or if spoken, a string of phoneme. I can't pronounce that word. The meanings of words are not found under rocks or fished from streams. Rather, the meaning of a word is simply a matter of how people use it. Although it can be very confusing and counterproductive if the same string of letters is used in different ways by different people, there is nothing necessarily dishonest in that. What is dishonest, however, is to pretend that Alfred Binet and Théophile Simon meant one thing by intelligence, when in fact they were very careful to say the opposite. And hence the problem. Because what IQ testers have done is convince everybody that the Binet-Simon tests, the basis of all IQ testing, supposedly measure an innate, genetic, and fixed, unalterable mental ability. Even though the authors of these measures defined their construct, intelligence, as stuff learned in a particular culture at a particular time, which is a dramatically opposite definition. Debunking the myths of so-called IQ research, cultural psychologist Michael Cole has recently pointed this out, quoting French authors. Quote, Binet and Simon offered a definition of the quality they sought to test for. It seems to us that in intelligence, There is a fundamental faculty, the alteration or lack of which is of the utmost importance for practical life. This faculty is judgment, otherwise called good sense, practical sense, initiative, the faculty of adapting oneself to circumstances. To judge well, to reason well, these are the essential activities of intelligence. That's from Binet and Simon, 1916, page 43. There's a footnote at the end of this for all these sources and citations. You can click the article in the description link if you're interested. Quote, good sense, which the French researchers equated to practical sense, is not an innate faculty naturally. It is acquired. It is the sort of thing people develop if they have certain experiences growing up. Binet and Simon constructed tests to measure the degree to which a kid has developed this practical sense, or, what is the same, the degree to which a child was adapting to circumstances. So it is important not to be distracted by the words of, quote, fundamental faculty, end quote, above, because of what Binet and Simon were interested in was the, quote, the alteration of this faculty, which they perceived to be, quote, of the utmost importance for practical life. It follows that the Binet-Simon tests are useful merely for telling us who has absorbed more of what the local culture demands that people learn, and who has absorbed less, nothing more. To leave no doubt about this, consider how carefully Alfred Binet himself explained what the point of his work was. Quote, to ascertain a particular level of intelligence is not interesting unless one adds an interpretation of what causes that level. So we must ask each time, what is the influence of the family and social environment? A child from a good family who converses often with his parents will have greater awareness than a child left to his own devices. The first will have especially a richer vocabulary and more complete notions of all sorts of things. Our tests provide reference points most relevant to the primary school population in Paris. If you take, for example, children from wealthy families, it is absolutely certain that they will answer better on average and will be 1 or 2 years ahead of primary school children in general. Children from rural areas perhaps will do less well than the Parisian average. Children from Belgium, from where French and Walloon are both spoken, will do less well still, especially in the language items. Our colleague Roma, professor at the École Normale d'Institut in Charleroi, I can't pronounce these French words, Charleroi, has brought to our attention to surprising inequalities in intelligence that he has documented with the use of our tests, and which depend on the environment. According to Alfred Binet, a child's level of intelligence is caused primarily by the influences of the family and social environment. But family does not mean hereditary here, given that a child from a good family is one who converses often with his parents. And such a child, Binet says, will have a greater awareness than a child left to his own devices, leading to a richer vocabulary and more complete notions of all sorts of things. He was just stating the obvious. When parents educate their children more, the kids learn more, and hence become more intelligent. That's how Binet used the word. Children from wealthy families would have, on average, access to a higher quality educational environment. So Binet considered it self-evident, or in his words, absolutely certain, that children from wealthy families will answer better on average. In other words, children will learn whatever it is they are locally taught and whatever is locally available for them to soak up. The argument is not supposed to be subtle. What follows? that Binet did not create a test that would measure the intelligence of kids everywhere in the world, because kids in different parts of the world were growing up in environments that demanded that they learn different things. Each locality thus required a different test. According to Binet, produced a test for the culture of Paris public school. Quote, our intelligence tests provide reference points most relevant to the primary school population in Paris, end quote. Naturally, he expected that children from rural areas perhaps will do less well because these kids were growing up in a different environment, i.e., they were not growing up in a Parisian public school. The same applied with greater force to children growing up in a different country, Belgium. As Binet went out of his way to explain the causes of differences in performance in his tests were environmental, he said, quote, ascertaining a level of intelligence does not tell us whether a child who is lagging behind is in a phase of intellectual relaxation of either short or long duration. It does not tell us either whether his intellectual impairment is caused by a blockage of his nasal cavities because of a problem with his lymph nodes. Any such investigations must be done around the test. They are important and require the most careful, detached, and objective attention. Far be it from us to turn this into an assembly line process, end quote. We shall have, on occasion, later to consider in detail the assembly line process against which Alfred Binet warned, but for now let us focus on everything else he says above. Binet's reference to a phase of intellectual relaxation of either short or long duration reveals that, as he defined the word, the intelligence of a child was not a fixed thing. It could wax and wane. Moreover, a child who did poorly could be doing so for any number of reasons, and Binet chooses the example of a blockage of his nasal cavities, the most prosaic example imaginable, to underline his point. You will notice that one possible cause of lower scores that Binet didn't even think worth considering was heredity. As Edwin Black points out, Binet insists that heredity was in no way a predeterminer of intelligence, because in Binet's theory, the construct was almost entirely environmental. In fact, when others spoke of intelligence as innate and unalterable, Alfred Binet reacted negatively and forcefully. Quote, in a book written for popular consumption, Les Aides modernes sur les enfants, 1909, Binet commented specifically on the claims of others that intelligence might be considered both innate and immutable. We must protest and react against this brutal pessimism. I take it that I have made Alfred Binet's views clear. Let us now examine a very different definition of intelligence, that of British psychologist Cyril Burt. Quote, by intelligence, the psychologist understands inborn, all-around intellectual ability. It is inherited, or at least innate, not due to teaching or training. It is intellectual, not emotional or moral, and remains uninfluenced by industry or zeal. It is general, not specific, i.e., it is not limited to any particular kind of work, but enters into all we do or say or think. Of all our mental qualities, it is the most far-reaching. End quote. Whereas for Binet, heredity was in no way a predeterminer of intelligence. Burt, by contrast, said that intelligence was inborn, inherited, innate, which is to say predetermined by heredity. And lest he be misunderstood, Burt asserted that intelligence could not be altered in the least, as it was supposedly uninfluenced by industry or zeal. Alfred Binet was by contrast interested in the alteration of the faculty of adapting oneself to circumstances. In other words, the alteration of the faculty of self-alteration. What accounts for such perfect contradiction between views of Alfred Binet and Cyril Bert? This: the French psychologist Alfred Binet was not a eugenicist. He believed that one's environment shaped one's mind. By contrast, Cyril Bert was a eugenicist, and eugenicists believe that intelligence is utterly a matter of one's genes. In the following chapter, I will explain in detail what a eugenicist is. For now, the matters are the following 2 points. 1. Although Alfred Binet and Cyril Bert both used the word intelligence, they were not talking about the same thing at all. Bert was imagining something innate and unalterable, whereas Binet had in mind something environmentally determined and eminently alterable. 2. The tests that Alfred Binet and Theophile Simon elaborated were designed to measure what Alfred Binet defined, not what Cyril Bert defined. Now, it followed from Binet's environmental theory that people could be trained to become more intelligent, and consequently, Binet claimed that if somebody scored low on his tests, this person merely required an alternative pedagogical approach plus practice to improve their scores. Such industry and zeal, claimed Binet, would be helping him literally to become more intelligent than he was before. As it turns out, the French psychologist understood his own test perfectly, and he provided the demonstration. Binet developed mental and physical exercises designed to raise his students' intelligence levels. These exercises actually yielded improved scores. This is not remarkable, it is obvious. Binet and Simon had designed tests to measure stuff learned in a particular culture at a particular time. Naturally, practice and effort will increase the amount of stuff learned, and there are ways of doing this and that are more effective than others. So finding a better pedagogic approach for a given student will naturally result in improved scores. What's remarkable is this, quote, in 1913, Cyril Bert was hired as Britain's first professional educational psychologist by the London County Council, the agency that ran all of London's publicly funded schools. Here he had responsibility for advising one of the world's largest school systems on practical issues regarding hundreds of thousands of pupils. Britain, too, had passed universal education laws like those in France, which had stimulated Binet and Simon's work. Bert now learned firsthand about Binet testing methods, which he adapted to his own English-speaking population. In his first year alone, he oversaw the testing of more than 2,000 suspected retarded children. The above should be causing you to do a double take. Binet and Simon's tests obviously do not measure what Cyril Bert defined as intelligence, and yet these are precisely the tests that Bert used. What would be the consequence of this? As Binet had observed, it was absolutely certain that children from wealthy families would score higher on average in tests of stuff learned. Why? Obviously, because such children grew up in an environment with richer educational opportunities, which their wealthier parents had the wherewithal to provide. But if Bert defined intelligence as something inborn, inherited, innate, what do you suppose would be his conclusion upon finding that rich kids did relatively better in the Binet-Simon tests? Quote, Bert noted that the exclusive prep school boys scored higher than their ordinary counterparts, and the question now arose as to why. Bert argued that environment or training could not have been very important, and the differences must have been innate. And Bert is not alone. The entire intelligence testing movement has cheerily adopted Binet and Simon's tests while claiming, believe it or not, that they measure what Cyril Bert defined as innate and unalterable intelligence. This is still going on today. We shall come back to this contradiction, but first, we will take a closer look at the logic behind the Binet-Simon tests, the better to understand what they are and what they do and do not measure. Then we shall return to Cyril Burt and explain why and how he completely misused these tests. How did the Binet-Simon tests work? Cultural psychologist Michael Cole explains what the Binet-Simon tests measured. Quote, Binet and Simon observed classrooms, looked at textbooks, talked to teachers, and used their intuition to arrive at some idea of the many kinds of knowledge and skills that children are expected to master in school. What they found was not easy to describe briefly, as anyone who looked into a classroom can testify. There was an obvious need to understand graphic symbols, such as alphabets and number systems, but recognition was not enough. Children were also expected to manipulate these symbols to store and retrieve vast amounts of information, to rearrange this information according to the demands of the moment, and to use the information to solve a great variety of problems that had never arisen before in their experience. Thus, children's abilities to remember and carry out sequences of movements, to define words, to construct plausible event sequences from jumbled pictures sequences, and to recognize the missing elements in graphic designs were tested, along with many other components of school-based problems. It was obvious that to master more and more esoteric applications of the basic knowledge contained in alphanumeric writing systems, pupils had to learn to master their own behavior. They had not only to engage in a variety of mental activities directed at processing information, they also had to gain control over their own attention, applying it not according to the whim of the moment, but according to the whim of the teacher and the demands of the text. End quote. But there was too much stuff going on in the French schools. One test could not cover all kinds of thinking the schools required, nor could such a test be appropriate for kids of all ages, since different demands were made on different kids of different ages. Furthermore, Binet and Simon were aware that different kids would have different kinds of exposure to the contents of school instruction before arriving in school. Binet and Simon did not think their tests could do justice to what the kids were asked to learn, but they believed that knowing a child's current abilities would be useful to teachers anyway. Useful for what? As a diagnostic tool to see who is learning and who it wasn't. In other words, the Binet and Simon tests were not fundamentally different from the tests that school teachers were already using, except for a certain amount of abstraction and standardization. Thus, Binet and Simon chose, quote, a sample of school-like tasks appropriate for each year of education, starting with the elementary grades and reaching into higher levels of curriculum. But because no firmly based theory of higher psychological functions existed, they had to rely on a combination of their own common sense and a logical analysis of tasks that the classrooms seemed to require. Since there was no independent ground from which to make the evaluations, quote, Binet and Simon hit the handy strategy of letting the children themselves tell them when an item selected for the test was appropriate. An average child would then be one who solved problems appropriate to his or her own age level. And what are the problems appropriate to his or her own age level? Those which are, on average, solved by kids of that age. It is easily demonstrated that tests designed to measure stuff learned, such as those elaborated by Binet and Simon, are going to be fatally misleading if taken as measures of ability to learn. All I have to do is make a point that, despite being obvious, really needs to be made. Many people whose smarts nobody doubts learned next to nothing in elementary and high school. I offer myself as an example. I nearly flunked I nearly flunked for 5 straight years because I was not learning any math, and this despite the fact that I was getting tutoring outside of school. Then I also had trouble because I was not learning any biology. The minute I entered higher education, however, I blossomed. In fact, I exploded. I had never enjoyed studying before, but now that I was studying something that I liked, I was losing sleep because I was having too much fun learning. The best evidence for the flip is again math. I corrected my deficiencies in math by teaching myself algebra and calculus with a book during my free time. And the reason I was motivated to do so is that I had fallen in love with biology. I wanted to learn evolutionary game theory. I would not have tried this except that my father assured me that I could do it. I was skeptical because my earlier school experiences had taught me that I was bad at math. But I was wrong. It turned out that I was good at it, even if my having started so late was still a handicap. And I enjoy it to boot, whereas previously there had been no greater nemesis. So testing me for stuff learned during my school years never reflected my mathematical and biological aptitudes. But that's what Binet and Simon invented, tests to find out which kids had learned and which hadn't. That's all. In other words, the point for Binet and Simon was mainly to improve pedagogy. I can't pronounce that word. Not to find out which kids had innate intelligence, whatever that means, and which didn't. Binet and Simon assumed that individual variations in the children would make them more or less susceptible to different kinds of pedagogic practices, and they wanted to identify those who did not respond well to the standard pedagogic practices that the French school systems had settled on. Once identified, new procedures of instruction might be invented to get children who were lagging behind to achieve the same level of culturally expected performance. That's what the tests were useful for. Naturally, because this was France, the schools were preparing kids for French culture, and this naturally became the bias in the tests. Binet and Simon were interested in actual practical performance in Parisian school culture, not in abstract innate ability. Now let me add another obvious point that nevertheless needs to be made. Having different genes is only one of the things that can make children differentially susceptible to specific pedagogic practices. For example, children attending the same school will come from different social and family backgrounds, etc., and these can all affect the degree to which they are responsive to particular schooling approach. I, for example, have an extremely interesting family, and perhaps this is why I was so bored in school. But other students were much less bored than I was, and they flourished and learned a lot. Such differences in susceptibility to particular training methods are not intelligence as the term now understood by IQ researchers, because if the system of instruction should be altered, then one will find that the supposedly smart and dumb kids are different ones. Precisely because of these considerations, Binet and Simon saw intelligence as an end state, something that you would guide your children to, not an inherent faculty that could not be altered. And they were concerned to find new cultural technologies to modify and alter this faculty in order to get all children to the same end state. To sum up, the Binet-Simon tests were simply tests of what the kids were supposed to be learning in school, calibrated in such a way that the average kid was in fact learning would function as a standard. What the average kid was in fact learning would function as a standard. In this way, a normal kid is just a kid with average scores. The tests, which would grandfather all IQ tests, were therefore not independent of what kids were actually doing in French schools. They were what the kids were doing in French schools. The Binet-Simon tests were merely descriptive tools that showed the distribution of stuff learned by kids under a specific pedagogic regime at a given point in time in a given culture. Binet and Simon no doubt thought themselves as psychologists, but what they were doing was closer to what naturalists of human species, ethnographers, do by profession: produce rich cultural descriptions. In their case, Binet and Simon were describing the cognitive and pedagogic requirements and assumptions of the French school system. And little has changed since then, as Michael Cole explains. Quote, "A great deal of work has gone into the construction of tests since these early efforts, but the underlying logic has remained pretty much the same. Sample the kinds of activities demanded by the culture, reduced in practice to the culture of the school. Children who have mastered far less than the average for their age are those who will need extra help if they are to reach the level expected by the culture." But although the logic of the tests has remained the same, many leading psychologists suddenly decided that what Binet-Simon tests were measuring was an unalterable and innate ability, and measuring overall intellectual prowess, as we saw, for example, Cyril Burt doing above. This is nonsense. It is likewise nonsense that so many psychologists should have pretended that the Binet-Simon tests can be used to make cross-cultural comparisons. I turn to this next. Shout out to Shroomy. The Binet-Simon test cannot be used cross-culturally. Michael Cole explains that psychologists have ignored Binet and Simon's warnings about the problems of dealing with children from different cultural backgrounds. And because these warnings have been ignored, cross-cultural measures with these tests have produced the supposed demonstration that people in one place are innately smarter than people in another. The fallacy of this is easily exposed. Consider a cognitive ability at which I do very poorly as the result of my cultural background. I am not very good at finding relatively small and well-camouflaged objects at great distances, the "Where's Waldo" problem. The Mongolian herders among whom I do my ethnographic work are, by contrast, geniuses at this. Do I think they have smarter genes than mine? Not for a minute. I think I know how they got this smart. These nomads spend their entire lives trying to find animals that stray from their herds onto the mountains, deserts, and plains. They live at the intersection of three different ecologies. Their culture thus requires them to learn how to distinguish objects that appear tiny and which are embedded in complex backgrounds. I am always as astonished at their seemingly superhuman feats of recognition as they are disappointed in my apparently subhuman stupidity and helplessness, which amounts to a kind of facultative blindness. In one particularly dramatic demonstration, one of my best friends, Mukhtar, became increasingly exasperated as he spent an entire half hour pointing to a camel on a mountain slope that I simply could not see. His initial shock at my inability to see the camel was such that he turned it into a series of careful experiments. First, he pressed his head against mine, cheek and jaw, with our arms parallel and his hand clasped over mine. He made me point at the camel and try to make my gaze look at the proper place on the opposite mountain. No luck. He tried describing features of the environment next to the camel. No luck. He laughed. "Get on your horse," he commanded, and off we went at a brisk trot towards the blasted camel. He tested me several times as we approached to see if I had now found it. and I began to grow annoyed with the increasing mirth that bubbled from his disbelief when he repeatedly confirmed that I could not spot the beast. In the end, it was necessary for us to approach in our horses until we were really very close to this camel before I could see it. To make matters worse, it had been moving. Although the shock of this left Mukhtar speechless, it did not impair his ability to howl for what I thought was much too long. To my way of thinking, this was entirely unfair to me. Why should I be expected to excel at cognitive abilities in which I was not trained? My retina captures the same images as the retinas of my herder friends, but my childhood was not spent finding stray animals on the mountains and steeps, and hence I cannot easily solve this kind of problem. I am certain that my genes are perfectly adequate and that if I had been adopted at birth by a Mongolian herder family, that I would be spotting animals on the mountain like the best of them. Another herder-relevant cognitive ability at which I do very poorly, and which produces a kind of resigned pity in my herder friends whenever I give evidence of it, concerns tying and untying all sorts of complicated or deceptively simple knots, matching a specific knot to its proper problem, improvising a good new knot for a special and unusual situation, choosing a proper knot from the repertoire in a new situation, and so forth. There is no question that relatively sophisticated understanding of 3D topology and the physics of friction are required here. There is no question that this is a problem-solving ability. That a Western egghead like myself usually has no need to develop these particular cognitive abilities is precisely the point. I am sure I could be just as good at this if I had been doing it from an early age, and am quite confident my genes are perfectly adequate. Thank you. Now suppose that Mongolian psychologists had taken the lead in IQ testing because the Mongolian government had asked them to devise a test identifying laggards in the acquisition of skills that matter to the Mongolian herding culture. One of the items in the test would certainly have been the ability to distinguish small objects in complicated backgrounds at great distances. Another item would require that people diagnose new situations recommended solution knots, that they look at a new knot and say what will happen if this or that end is pulled, etc. The test would also include terribly culture-specific items such as the kind of reactions you must have when an elder scolds you, etc. For items of this sort also appear in IQ tests. And the respect shown for elders in Mongolian herding cultures is an extreme reverence entirely alien to Americans. If Mongolian psychologists had then decided that what they were testing was an innate and unalterable ability called intelligence, they would have found that after subjecting populations in different parts of the world to this test, that people elsewhere, and in particular Americans with PhDs, were not that smart. But would that be fair? Michael Cole puts his argument to his readers in the words of Florence Goodenough, a psychologist writing in 1936. Quote, is it good enough? Goodenough identified the crucial shortcomings of the logic of this enterprise in a way that has very broad, if rarely recognized, implications when she wrote, "The fact can hardly be too strongly emphasized that neither intelligence tests nor the so-called tests of personality and character are measuring devices. They are sampling devices." Goodenough argued that when applied in American society, IQ tests represent a reasonable sampling device because they are representative samples of the kind of intellectual tasks that American city dwellers are likely to be called upon to perform. But such tests are not representative of life in other cultural circumstances, and hence their use as a measuring device measuring devices for purposes of comparison is inappropriate. This injunction applies no less, of course, to variations among subgroups living in the United States than peoples living in economically less developed societies. But the ultimate demonstration that the Binet and Simon tests and other tests built on the same principle do not measure an innate and unalterable faculty comes from something that psychologists who use IQ tests call the Flynn effect. For the last 50 years, the raw IQ scores of Western countries have been going steadily up, dramatically so. What can this mean? Well, the passage of one generation is entirely insufficient to produce a dramatic reorganization of the Western brain by the action of natural selection, so that cannot be what happened. The obvious hypothesis here is that kids in these countries watch more TV, leading to more encyclopedic knowledge about all sorts of things. Just to give one example, supposing you watched Dick Wolf's Law and Order, you know a great deal about the criminal justice system. 50 years ago, there was no such show remotely like it, for Law and Order goes out of its way to be pedagogic, as no show before it has. It is also quite possible that because kids these days play hours and hours of Tetris and also 3D shoot-'em-up video games, this has given them exquisitely good training in object rotation, which figures prominently in IQ tests. Whatever the specifics, the fact of the Flynn effect is powerful evidence that IQ tests are not measuring an innate and fixed ability. In fact, the Flynn effect is possible only if IQ tests are measuring stuff learned, which is precisely what Binet and Simon designed them to test. The acquisition of culturally specific set of cognitive tools and knowledge base. That kids in the West should score better in these tests when they get more training in what the tests measure is surprising only to those who, against all reason, insist in pretending that IQ tests measure Cyril Burt's definition of intelligence. So let us consider the question honestly. Did Cyril Burt make an innocent mistake? Given that Cyril Burt absurdly claimed that the Binet and Simon tests were measuring his own entirely opposite concept, why did he? Why was this an innocent mistake? As mentioned earlier, a detailed examination of the ideology of eugenics will have to await the next chapter, but we can at least foreshadow that by stating that eugenicists had an aristocratic ideology and wished to argue that members of the lower classes were innately stupid, the better to mobilize the institutions of the state against them. Cyril Burt was a major exponent of eugenics. It is therefore suspicious that he misused Alfred Binet's tests, as we saw, to claim that the rich students in prep schools were innately smarter. And that suspicion is rewarded because it turns out that Cyril Burt was an all-around fraud. Quote, a year after Burt's death, Princeton psychologist Leon Kamin began to scrutinize his statistics and found major flaws. For one thing, in 3 different studies of different numbers of identical twins, Burt reported the same statistical correlation of IQ scores to the 3rd decimal point, which is incredible. There were similar flaws in Burt's reports dating back as far as 1909. In 1976, London's Sunday Times, in an article by Oliver Gilley, reported the shocking fact that Burt's 2 field investigators and co-authors of his studies, Margaret Howard and J. Conway, were non-existent. These 2 phantom experts had often signed reviews praising Burt and attacking his enemies in the British Journal of Statistical Psychology during the 15 years when Burt was its editor. Burt's housekeeper admitted to the Sunday Times that she knew he used pseudonyms. It seems clear that Burt had solemnly reported non-existent tests and studies and had signed fictitious names to articles he published. There is no way for researchers to discover which parts of his life work might be valid because he often referred to unpublished reports that can't be found. and he carelessly stuffed whatever papers he kept into 6 chests instead of filing them. These papers were all burned after his death, according to Science magazine. This forgery may rank with that of the Piltdown Man. That Cyril Burt was a complete fraud is important because he was prominent and therefore influential. The article quoted immediately above begins by putting status in context. Sir Cyril Burt became the most prestigious, powerful, and influential psychologist since American genius William James. And Cyril Burt was not merely a prominent fraud, he was a truly bold one, accusing that it was his detractors who were dishonest and driven by ideological motives. You know, that's one thing I notice these manipulative people do, is they accuse you of what they do. I see that all the time on YouTube and in the mainstream media. Okay, quote, Cyril Burt, invoking faked data compiled by the non-existent Miss Conway, complained that doubts about the genetic foundation of IQ appear to be based rather on the social ideals or the subjective preferences of the critics than on any first-hand examination of the evidence supporting the opposite view, end quote. We now have sufficient context in the background to introduce one Arthur Jensen, a student of eugenicist by the name of Hans Eysenck, whose own mentor was Cyril Burt. Arthur Jensen is the man responsible for reviving intelligence testing in recent times. Here is John Enting, remember him, explaining this in Taboo. Quote, almost overnight in 1969, after 2 decades in which intelligence research was viewed as academic graveyard and a taboo subject in general, an article in an unlikely place, the normally staid Harvard Educational Review, exploded like a forgotten landmine, scattering shards of racial controversy far and wide. The title, How Much Can We Boost IQ and Scholastic Achievement? It's author Arthur Jensen. Why is it that for 2 decades before 1969, intelligence research was viewed as an academic graveyard and taboo subject in general? Well, because of the 2 decades before 1969 and the 2 decades after the end of World War II, in which there was a genocide against the Jews and systematic extermination of Russians, Serbs, Gypsies, and others. These outrages were the culmination of a movement called eugenics that had lifted intelligence testing as its pseudo-scientific flag, using it as a diagnostic tool to determine who would and who would not be exterminated. We shall examine how American eugenics movement helped produce Nazism, German Nazism later. But the point that matters here is that black people in the U.S. did relatively poorly in IQ tests because they had little access to educational opportunities. And these tests were designed to measure how much of a culture of upper-class white society a person had acquired. Blacks were barely exposed to this culture, so naturally they had not to acquire it. The claim that they were innately stupid had done poorly on IQ tests and therefore obviously nonsense, but this was Arthur Jensen's claim. So a side note here real quick. This is why you see the current attack on white culture right now, white males, and the promotion of all these minority cultures, because they want as ignorant population as possible. And so they got all the white kids hooked on black culture, hip hop and stuff. And they've been really trying to destroy this white culture where it's not cool to be ignorant, pretty much is what's going on with that. They want us to be ignorant. So I'm going to continue reading. Psychologist Peter Schoenemann explains, quote, Jensen achieved instant notoriety when he challenged the received view that intelligence is primarily a function of environment, not genes. This environmental position had gained ground after World War II, gradually replacing earlier eugenics thesis to the contrary. In his 1969 Harvard Educational Review paper, Jensen claimed that previous attempts to narrow the black-white gap on IQ tests were doomed to failure because, according to him, blacks are deficient in the particular genes required for complex information processing. I dropped my mouse because I'm dumb. What followed, as Schoenman goes on to explain, quote, Jensen argued that futile efforts to bring black children up to the level of whites, such as Head Start, should be replaced with more realistic alternatives to guard against dysgenic trend towards genetic enslavement, end quote. And now what they're doing is they're trying to bring whites, the level of whites, down to like where the blacks are at. That's what they're trying to make us ignorant now. Jensen was producing an argument against social equality that claimed the differences observed between whites and blacks were innate, as opposed to resulting from widespread racism in American society. I remind you that 1969, when Jensen published his article, was a time when the civil rights battles were still being fought. Martin Luther King was murdered on April 4th, 1968, but not by James Earl Ray Jr. Or, I mean, what's that guy's name? Crap. I think that was his name. I think I got it right. Shit. Now, since Jensen is a direct intellectual descendant of a eugenicist and fraud, Cyril Burt, it does not look good that Jensen should be the one to have broken the taboo against intelligence testing in 1969, reviving eugenics arguments. But the problem is not one of mere appearances. Jensen has gone out of his way to say that he approves of Burt. In May of 1957, Arthur Jensen went to hear Cyril Burt deliver his Bingham Memorial Lecture on Inheritance of Mental Ability. Jensen was impressed and concluded it was probably the best lecture I've ever heard. Moreover, Jensen had defended Burt's frauds. Arthur Jensen insisted that if Burt had been trying to fake his data, he would have done a better job of it. Of course, Jensen is more or less required to defend Cyril Burt because he has relied on Burt's made-up data in his own work. As the Raymond Fancher explains in The Intelligence Men, makers of the IQ controversy, in 1969, Jensen's case for black genetic inferiority rested on a presumed IQ heritability of 80, a figure derived from the fraudulent Burt studies. And not only has Jensen relied on Burt's frauds, he has produced some of his own. It would take us too far afield to explain why Jensen's statistics are phony, but interested readers may consult the work of psychologist Peter Schoenman, who has shown that Jensen's Ersatz statistic is a travesty of Spearman's. In other words, Jensen has abused the statistical reasoning of his intellectual ancestor, Charles Spearman, beyond all recognition. But this is not the end of it, because, as we shall see in the next chapter, Spearman's reasoning itself is nonsense. Given all this, it is more than a little chilling that John Entine should refer to Arthur Jensen as a respectable psychologist at the University of California at Berkeley, a careful academician with sterling credentials in that field. Why? Because it means that the man who argues with absurd nonsense for the innate athletic superiority of black people is praising the man who relies on a eugenicist fraud in order to allege the innate intellectual inferiority of black people. Physical prowess plus intellectual inferiority. As you may recall from the introduction, these are the two sides of the coin of the racist credo traditionally published by the white upper classes in American society. So, it is not exactly surprising that the chapter in which John Entine praises Arthur Jensen has for title Sports and IQ. And moreover, that he announces how he will consider the supposed genetic seesaw with physical ability on one end and smarts on the other. Entine wants to make sure that you get the point. Better evidence that he is pushing racism is not really needed, and yet we shall have occasion to see such evidence. In order to get the full chill, however, it is important first to paint a more complete picture of what eugenics movement was, the better to understand what the likes of Arthur Jensen and John Entine may have been trying to revive, and that topic will be for the next chapter, which I won't read because my voice is starting to fail. So, I think that's pretty interesting stuff. Probably put some of you black people listening to sleep. I'm just kidding. Yeah. Whoa. My poker coach was here. All right. Well, have a good night, everyone, if you're still watching. And remember that IQ tests are bullshit.
Fake faces hiding everywhere. Made up makeup, made up stares to hide their stolen air. Don't look too close, don't you dare. Stupid seems to be in the air, everywhere. Blameless, I'll shatter through the glare. Make it, take it, they won't share. I can't fake it, I'll just make it on my own. I can't blame them, I'll just make them on my throne. I can't fake it, I'll just make it on my own. I can't blame them, I've just got to get to my throne. I'm in the latest colors, I sing the newest songs. I read all the lyrics so I can sing along. I am the latest colors, I stand above my throne, waiting for an invite to never come along. I am the latest colors, I sing the newest songs. I read all the lyrics so I can sing along. I am the latest colors, I hate the newest songs. I can stand the lyrics, I never sing along. I'll never sing along. I'll never sing along. I'll never sing along. Trade places, stagger truth or dare. Only ask it if you care. Trace back to all the millionaires. Snake oil traders, no one shares. Soulless and stealing what they dare. Hold your deck to your chest. Faceless, nobody is your friend. Make it, take it, they won't share. I can't fake it, I'll just make it on my own. I can't blame them, I'll just name them on my throne. I can't fake it, I'll just make it on my own. I can't blame them, I've just got to get to my throne. I am the latest colors, I sing the newest songs. I read all the lyrics so I can sing along. I am the latest colors, I hate the newest songs. I can stand the lyrics, I never sing along. I'll 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 never sing along. I am the latest colors, I sing the newest songs. I read all the lyrics so I can sing along. I am the latest colors, I stand above my throne, waiting for an invite to never come along. I am the latest colors.